Now we move on to the final session of the debate, in which each of the panelists has 2 minutes to summarize. I will step in at the 2-minute mark just to tell you that your time is up, and we're going to begin the summary against the motion that George W. Bush is the worst president of the last 50 years. Bill Kristol, the editor of the Weekly Standard.
As someone who grew up not far from here, it's embarrassing, frankly, that 83% of the people who voted think either that Bush is the worst president in 50 years or are undecided about it. Look, people don't have to like Bush. Half the country voted against him in 2000 and virtually almost half in 2004. If you're a liberal, you want to approve of his domestic policies. If you think that we'd be better off not having gone into Iraq, which obviously is a debatable proposition, you could be very condemnatory of going into Iraq, and certainly many people have criticized the way in which we managed that war from 2004 to 2006. There's no reason not to be critical of Bush, not to disagree with Bush, not to prefer Obama, not to have voted for Gore and Kerry. Most people in New York obviously have all those views. But to think that he's the worst president in 50 years is just silly. It's just silly, and it came out very well in the Vietnam discussion. I mean, are we being serious here? Vietnam was well run, and that was okay somehow, and Westmoreland knew what he was doing. Of course, we lost 55,000 people. We lost a war. 2 million people plus died in Vietnam and Cambodia. It was an unbelievable catastrophe, which the region took a long time to recover from. It was a terrible humiliation, moral and political, for the United States. That's like Iraq, where we've lost 4,000 soldiers, where Iraq is now back on its feet, where we've won the war, and established U.S. credibility and a willingness to stick to it, even though we've made terrible mistakes, and where we're actually in pretty good shape with most of the governments in the region. I myself, being more of a democracy and human rights activist, I'm a little unhappy that we're so friendly with the governments.
Your time is up. 15 seconds grace.
With the governments in the region, but we are. So if we're in the real world, you can dislike George W. Bush, but you should be against this motion.
Summing up for the motion that George W. Bush is the worst American president in the last 50 years, Jacob Weisberg, author of The Bush Tragedy and editor-in-chief of the Slate Group. Jacob Weisberg.
Thank you. We won the war in Iraq. There's something about this mission accomplished language that always makes me a little nervous. I think the damage in Iraq can be mitigated, but it can't. The war can't be vindicated as a decision. And this goes to the heart of our disagreement. Bill said at the beginning that Bush had bad choices. I don't think he had bad choices. I think he made bad choices. And I think things could have been different for Bush. I think he could have taken a different approach, and in fact it was the approach he took when he was governor of Texas. He could have united the country and the world after September 11th. It would have given him an opportunity to be a great president. He could have reached out to the other party the way FDR did after Pearl Harbor. He could have kept his focus on America's real enemies as opposed to becoming distracted by Saddam Hussein. He could have compromised with Democrats on a whole range of issues, including climate change, expanding health care coverage, entitlement reform. He could have focused on protecting the free market instead of the interests of big business. And I think if Bush had tried to govern from the center right instead of from the far right, he would have been reelected by a bigger margin in 2004, and he would have been a successful president. But Bush was never up to the job of being president, and it's not a matter of lacking in intelligence, it's a matter of lacking character. Bush wasn't interested enough in policy. He couldn't tolerate challenge or dissent or disagreement. He couldn't open his mind long enough to consider alternatives or admit the possibility that he might sometimes be wrong. He let his righteousness and his arrogance and his anger get the better of him. And in the end, I think what's so damning about Bush and what does make him the worst president of the last 50 years is that these were things within his control. And to finish, I think we can say at this point that America's great nepotistic experiment is finally coming to an end. And as my colleague Simon Jenkins has said, it's finishing not just with failure, not just with rejection, but in global disgrace.
Thank you, Jacob Weisberg. Making his summary statement against the motion that George W. Bush is the worst American president of the last 50 years, Karl Rove, former Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to George W. Bush.
John, you said that with a particular glee. I mean, it's... Look, I want to end with, by accentuating the point that Bill made. But first of all, I need to say Jacob's comments can be read in his book, which is a piece of fiction. To believe that George W. Bush didn't tolerate strong people in his cabinet or dissent or disagreements is ridiculous. And to suggest that he's not interested in ideas is that peculiar form of Bush hatred that causes people to lose their rational senses about the man. And this president has been on the receiving end of this kind of attitude since the moment that he took office in an election that many on the left thought made him an illegitimate president. Now, here's a man who the first person that he met with from the United States Congress was the ranking Democrat on the House Education and Labor Committee, George Miller. Didn't compromise with Democrats, on No Child Left Behind, which he worked with Ted Kennedy and George Miller and John Boehner and Judd Gregg to get passed. Didn't cooperate and compromise with Democrats when we came out and endorsed wholesale large elements of the Joe Lieberman program for Homeland Security. Didn't compromise with Democrats when we came out for immigration reform. You know, that's just ridiculous. But I want to end because most of the circles around Iraq. Vietnam, I agree, better prosecuted than Iraq. We ended Vietnam in defeat, for which the families of 55,000 fallen heroes had reason to ask themselves whether or not that sacrifice had been made in vain. And we are coming out of Iraq, with Iraq becoming a functioning, stable, semi-democracy in the heart of the Middle East, still fragile, but because of the surge, in a place today where we can see the moment that U.S. troops can come home with their honor and in victory, and for which the sacrifices of those who have died will not have been in vain.
Karl Rove, time up. Take 15 seconds if you need it. You're good? Karl Rove. Summing up, finally, for the motion that George W. Bush is the worst American president of the last 50 years, Simon Jenkins, journalist and columnist for The Guardian. Simon Jenkins.
Well, I repeat my view at the very beginning. I'm not here to be rude about an American president. I would just point out about Iraq. You cannot say something's a success when, as I saw last week, 2 million Iraqis are camped outside Damascus because they haven't got the nerve to go home to their homeland because the Americans are there. Two-thirds of all the Christians in Iraq have now been driven out of that country under America's aegis. Fundamentalism is far more rife in southern Iraq than it ever was under Saddam Hussein. Let's just get some facts here. However, let me come back to the original point. I had great respect for Bush when he came to power. I liked his courtesy, I liked his moderation, and I liked his concept of humility in America's power projection. I think, tragically, after 9/11, he allowed the politics of fear to get the better of him. He persuaded my Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to let the politics of fear aid his re-election campaign as well. The politics of fear is the most corrosive of all forms of politics in a democracy. Power at America remains a hugely powerful country. Power has an obligation of restraint. If you're the most powerful country in the world, your obligation is not to go over the top, charge around the world, invading countries on the feeblest of pretexts. Your obligation is to show restraint. My America was always a country of huge self-confidence, belief in its ability to resist attack of any sort, and not needing to erode its own freedoms and those of other people in order to achieve that defense of democracy. I personally think that you've just elected a man who I've found from when I first read his book a truly remarkable figure, on whom I think it is right to place great expectations. But he has got to recover from a terrible legacy in the world outside America. I still believe he will. I think you have a terrific future ahead of you, but you have been through an awful 8 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon Jenkins.